All right, if you've been in the class, you know that this entire discussion we're calling the creation of the kingdom. I'm putting it in 5 major sections that could be organized differently, I suppose, but the first part is the covenant offered. That was the story last week, the anointing at Bethany. Now we come to what I'm calling the covenant solemnized. This kingdom is based on a constitution that we call the New Covenant. And this is the point where in a solemnizing, a ceremonial way, this thing is brought into being. The run-up to it involves the story we have before us right now. The first day of unleavened bread, which is Thursday evening, when they killed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and prepare that you may eat the Passover?" So as I say, Thursday evening, they killed the Passover lamb. You're familiar with the Old Testament to know that the Passover had its roots in the Exodus. It was that moment when a so-called paschal lamb was slain, slaughtered. The blood was put on the doorposts and the lintel. You recall that from your Sunday school, right? Way back when. And then what did they do? They ate that paschal lamb. It was dinner. They ate it. And in a sense, by so doing, they became part of this that God was doing to liberate them. This is the Passover that all of the prior Passovers had been looking forward to. This, in a sense, is the true, definitive, final Passover. Because now the paschal lamb, to wit, Christ, is going to be slaughtered in a cutting ceremony, and his body and blood offered to his people. Hence we say in the Lord's Supper, "This is my body. This is my blood." We are eating, in a sense, it's graphic language, eating his body and blood. Jesus says it though, John chapter 6, "If you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, you don't have my life in you." And in this moment of celebrating a Passover, we in fact ingest this one. In some ways you'd say it's horrifying language. It was highly offensive to the first Jewish people that heard it, but it's so graphic, it's so powerful, that we begin to appreciate what is intimately communicated. So Jesus will say at this moment, "This is my body broken for you. Take it and eat it." This cup is the blood of the covenant. Drink it. Eat my flesh, drink my blood. Because that's what you do with the paschal lamb. And Jesus is the paschal lamb. So in a sense, what we're heading into right now is this holy moment when all the Passovers of the past are now going to be realized, consummated, as it were, in this moment. So the disciples ask the question, where do you want us to prepare? They don't, of course, understand quite all of this. We have 2,000 years of retrospection to figure some of this out, but they understand certainly that Jesus will celebrate the Passover with them. And so now the question is, where will that be? It has to be somewhere in Jerusalem. The Old Testament requires it, but they need to know what house, what place. So Jesus says to them, "Go into the city. A man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him." The 2 disciples he sent, Luke tells us, are Peter and John. We're told that they will meet a man. It sounds like prearrangement. This is a difference of opinion, and I'm not going to die on any hills at this point, but maybe this was Jesus' prophetic insight. Maybe it was prearrangement. Take your pick, fine with me. But one thing we do understand is that the water that was being carried here was undoubtedly in preparation for the Passover, and more importantly, it was quite unexpected that a man would be carrying water. In the ancient world, that was women's work. And it would be quite unexpected to find a man carrying the water for any purpose, even for the Passover celebration. Given the fact that the place where they're going has a large upper room, it sounds suspiciously like a similar place we hear of subsequently in the New Testament, with a large upper room. And we eventually learned that that house was owned by the mother of John Mark, who we believe is the author of this book. So it's at least hypothetically possible that the man that they encountered carrying the water was John Mark himself. And we're going to see some other evidence of that as we go along, not this morning, but later. But nevertheless, that's at least a hypothetical thought that you can entertain. The house with the upper room we recognize in other texts. It's the place where the disciples gathered after the ascension, but before Pentecost, large upper room. It's the place where they were on the day of Pentecost, 120 of them, so it was a quite large upper room. It's the place where Peter went after he was miraculously released from prison. Acts chapter 12, large upper room we hear of. So it seems likely that it's the same place. Traditionally, it was the oldest church in Jerusalem. It was called originally the Upper Church of the Apostles. The original church doesn't exist anymore, but it was the oldest church, the first church really erected there in Jerusalem. Jesus says with respect to this man, follow him. You notice a notable similarity with the triumphal entry that took place the previous Sunday, in which Jesus sends them on a journey, and yet everything was set up in advance, you know. One commentator said this is to make sure we understand nothing that's happening in the next couple of days is a train wreck. Jesus is not, he says, a tragic hero caught in events beyond his control. A lot of people like to make it something like that, but Jesus is fully in control here. Everything that's happening is happening according to plan, even his own crucifixion, obviously. And so at this point we're being reminded of that, even in the details of the way the story unfolds here. So without desperation, fear, anger, or futility, Christ is following a sovereign purpose. Jesus continues, where he goes in, say to the master of the house, the teacher says, where is the guest room in which I may eat the Passover with my disciples? We don't know who the master of the house is. We never hear of the husband of Mary, who is the father of John Mark. It could be John Mark himself is the master of the house. He might be the oldest male there. Usually a woman would not be called the master of the house, but otherwise we don't know. We just have to speculate on that. But elsewhere we're told that it was owned by the mother of John Mark, so we'll just leave it at that for now. He asks for a guest room. The word that's used here for guest room is actually a word that applied to a rented lodging. It suggests this place was something like a bed and breakfast. It had a large room upstairs that would be rented out to various users from time to time, and it again suggests that this room had therefore been reserved for this purpose, as if everybody knew this was exactly what was going to happen by some kind of prearrangement. The language at least certainly suggests something like that. So he's looking for this room, the place to eat the Passover with his disciples, and as I say, it's the foundational event. One theologian argued, I think persuasively, once upon a time in a lecture I was attending, that this was the true birthday of the church. We say, of course, the day of Pentecost is the true birthday. It's probably better to say that's the day the church was empowered, but really the ceremony that created the church was here. The kingdom is created here, birthed here, as it were, in this Passover celebration. Then he will show you a large upper room furnished and prepared. Make ready for us there. So this large upper room, again, corresponding to other descriptions of a similar facility. It's furnished. It's intended to accommodate people who would be staying there. It has a table. It has furniture, couches, tapestry. And Jesus says, so prepare the Passover there. The second little paragraph. So the disciples set out and went to the city and found everything as he had told them, and they prepared the Passover meal. When it was evening, he came with the 12, and when they had taken their places and were eating, Jesus said, truly I tell you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. They began to be distressed and say to him one after another, surely not I. He said to them, it is one of the 12, one of you 12, who is dipping bread into the bowl with me. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that one by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would be better for that one never to have been born. Well, his disciples go into the city. They found everything just as Jesus has said. Again, this appears to be Mark's gentle reminder that Jesus is in control. Things are happening the way he said. He's not surprised by any turn of events along the way. And they began to prepare the Passover, which is not a small deal. It involved taking the paschal lamb to the temple because the law required that the lamb be slaughtered in the temple. And by the way, there were thousands of lambs that were going to be slaughtered in the temple in the run-up to Passover. Josephus tells us about a later Passover, some years later, in which he gives us some statistics, that there were 250,000 paschal lambs that were slaughtered in the temple. They had hundreds and hundreds of priests on duty to carry out, because you couldn't do it at home. It had to be in the temple. And so, just to say that Peter and John took care of the lamb, they probably had to wait in line for a while, you know. The priest had to examine the lamb because it had to be without spot or blemish. It was required under the law that if a lamb was going to have effectiveness in the celebration, that this lamb not have any defects of any kind. Obviously, the whole reason for that is because the Old Testament looks forward to the Lamb without spot or defect, who must be slaughtered and eaten. And now Christ is the one who is going to consummate that expectation, but at this point we're still looking at the images that suggest it, namely this paschal lamb. So they do so. Then they return to bring this lamb back to the home where it'll be roasted. There's going to be other foods prepared. If you're familiar with the Seder meal, you know the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the wine, the water for purification, all of this must be done. So it took several hours. This was quite a project. Peter and John return, and then as a result of that, Jesus with the 12 comes to this place, and this is where now this meal is going to take place. Jim Edwards, in his comment on this particular incident, says it's almost certain that there were more people here than just Jesus and the 12 disciples. The room itself could accommodate over 100 people. We know that elsewhere. And the Passover was a family event. And all of these disciples had family, and it's highly probable that family was here, children were there, wives were there, other extended family were probably there. So this was probably a major event with a lot of people involved, and it was a time of what would ordinarily be rejoicing, a solemn meal, and yet a time of celebrating God's liberation of His people and so on. So if you can imagine that kind of atmosphere is part of what's going on. And you're probably also somewhat familiar, at least, with the Passover Liturgy itself. There was a preparation for the Passover that had two major themes to it: a retrospective theme and a prospective theme. Passover looked backwards and looked forwards. Passover obviously looked backward to the Passover, because it was at that point that God created the Jewish nation. They were liberated from Egypt, and that was really the moment when they ceased to be a family and began to be a nation. Here, a nation is also being created. A kingdom is being created in a similar way. This is the greater Passover, which answers to that which was anticipated in the Old Testament. But it's also a prospective celebration, because the realization of what the Passover anticipated was the coming of Messiah. And here we are at the Passover in which the anticipated Messiah has shown up. This is it. The prospective anticipation of the Passover is about to be realized in all of its richness at this moment. But the liturgy of the Passover had both of those elements to it. The beginning of the Passover would involve the recitation of the first three of the 6 so-called Hallel Psalms, 113 to 115. Psalm 113, if you want to go back and read them sometime soon, celebrates a majestic God stooping to help the humble people who cry out to Him. This is the Exodus story. Psalm 114 reinforces the greatest example of the sovereign God breaking into human history and liberating needy people is the Exodus. The most frequently mentioned event in Jewish history in the Old Testament is the Exodus. It is the defining moment when God's people are liberated. And then we have Psalm 115, in which, because of what God has done, there's a stern warning: don't worship any other gods. This is the only God worthy of worship, because He's the one who has liberated you. At the end of the Passover, some hours later, the last three Hallel psalms would be sung. This is 116, the next one, the great psalm of thanksgiving. You probably know that's probably the most famous thanksgiving psalm in the Old Testament. The shortest psalm, Psalm 117, which now invites Gentiles to come to Zion. It's about one verse long, and that's really what it says. And then Psalm 118, the most famous messianic psalm. The stone the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord. All those messianic statements we hear are in this psalm. This prospective anticipation of a Passover that looks forward to God finally providing all that He had promised at the beginning. So this is the basic lay of the land when we think about the Passover. The Passover actually takes place in 4 separate movements. There is initially what was called the blessing. This would be what we might call the invocation. So the head male, usually the oldest male present, would invoke the presence of God. He would pronounce a blessing over all of those who were present. By the way, I should mention each of these 4 was concluded with a glass of wine. So there are 4 glasses of wine. Don't worry, it took several hours. No one got inebriated here, but there was wine that was part of the celebration. And so the first one, this first invocation, would be celebrated with wine. The next step along the journey would be a question, a formula question asked by a child, which is, why is this night different from other nights? And that invites a response, a recitation of the story of the Exodus. Because this is the time when God liberated His people. We killed the paschal lamb, and the angel of death passed over, hence Passover, our dwellings, while the firstborn in Egypt were wiped out. You know the story of the Exodus, but it would be recited in that sort of way. That's the second stage of the journey, again followed by a glass of wine. The third stage would take several hours. It's called the Benediction, but it actually means the blessing on the food. So again, the father who was present would announce in a prayer a blessing on the unleavened bread, the bitter herbs, the greens, the stewed fruit, the roast lamb. This would take several hours and would be a time of conversation and so on. It wasn't all done in silence. This was supposed to be a bit of a festive kind of occasion, and it would conclude with the third glass of wine. I'm mentioning the wine for a reason, so I'm not just throwing that in for fun, but keep an eye on that. Then the fourth one is called the conclusion. The conclusion would involve the singing of those 3 concluding psalms, and then the 4th glass of wine. This conclusion always was looking forward to the point when God would make good on His promises, especially the messianic promise. And so the Passover always concluded with a note of hope, looking forward. What's interesting and somewhat unexpected, a subtlety here, but nevertheless critical to understanding it, is that as Mark tells the story and as Matthew tells the story, it's in Luke, the whole story is told a little bit differently, but in these 2 especially, the 4th glass of wine is not drunk. I will not drink this until I drink it with you in the kingdom, Jesus says. And it's unexpected because instead of properly concluding the Passover, it's postponed. Because you see, the paschal lamb had not yet been slain. It still had to take place. And so it's going to wait for a little time until you can properly drink the 4th glass of wine, which is the proper conclusion of the great final Passover, you see. And so that 4th glass of wine plays a rather critical role as the story unfolds. So it's postponed by Christ. We'll see that as we go along. Just by the by, this is another kind of Markan sandwich. We have Jesus announcing at this point betrayal. One of you will betray me. By the time the sandwich is over, we find out that in some ways all the disciples betrayed him. They all abandoned ship. They all left him twisting in the wind. They all ran for cover. The only one who hung in there was, and this is the heart of the matter, Jesus. Our Christian security has nothing to do with your faithfulness. It has to do with Christ's faithfulness to you. And the whole message of the gospel is that Christ has come and claimed us as his own. We fail, we fall on our faces, we are miserable and pathetic excuses for a Christian. Well, I don't know about you. I'm just speaking personally here. But Jesus is a wonderful Messiah, and he hangs onto us with... Our names are inscribed on the palms of his hands, we hear in the Old Testament. He has tattooed us onto his hands, and he hangs on to us. And in some ways the Passover is a wonderful reminder that while the disciples are a bunch of flakes, Jesus is the one who is for them, faithful to them throughout. And in some ways the faithfulness of Jesus is thus being contrasted with the faithlessness of these disciples. Well, in the context of the meal, this is the third part of the evening, Jesus says, "Assuredly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." At some point in this time when there would have been conversation going on anyway, it's highlighting the central point. Mark is passing over a lot of the extraneous details here to emphasize betrayal, emphasize failure on the part certainly of Judas, but on really the parts of all of them. One of you, he says, will betray me. One of these that is eating with Christ and participating, who is not only Judas, but really all of them who are there. It's clearly an allusion to Psalm 41:9. Even my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. And so the disciples begin to ask, is it I? Interestingly, no brave denials here. John tells the story a little differently, you may recall. Peter says, wait a minute, even if everybody abandons you, I won't. You remember all of that. But Mark gives them a more modest spin at this point. Surely not I, surely not I. It has been suggested, I think correctly, that in some ways this picture of the disciples is supposed to be a reminder for all of us to be on our guard, lest we be one of those who is by inches allowing denial of Christ to sneak into our lives. One commentator said, we must keep a sharp edge on our devotion to Christ. We betray him when we try to make him fit into our way of life and thought instead of changing our thoughts and ways to fit into his. He continues, Whistler, the artist, once said when told by a patron that a certain picture would not fit into one of his rooms, quote, "Man, you can't make the picture fit the room. You must make the room fit the picture." Jesus is not fitted into our lives. Our room must be arranged for him, you see. And as soon as we start trying to make Jesus kind of fit in, to my life, then we've probably gotten a little bit too close to the mark here. And so these guys are asking, is it I? It's a good question. I should ask that question to myself every day, evaluating my own motives. He answered and said, it's one of the 12, one of you 12, who dips with me in the dish. In the Passover there are multiple times when herbs and so on would be dipped in various kinds of sauces, etc. And so this is simply one of you who is participating in this meal with me. But when he says it's one of the 12, of course at that point he's ruling out all of the other people who were there. It's not one of the women over here, one of the teenagers over there, this person or that. No, it's one of you. You see, one of these intimates that is so closely tied to Christ. Well, true enough, one of them did betray him, but by dawn all of them had fled either from weakness or fear or cowardice or greed. So all of them dipping with him in the meal at the same time are the ones who are going to be fleeing from him when the heat in the kitchen gets excessive. The Son of Man, indeed, Jesus says, goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been good for that man if he'd never been born. Two things in this verse that are notable. The Son of Man goes as it has been written of him. But if we look in the Old Testament, we find no references to the Son of Man suffering. He's only painted in Daniel, of course, as one of great glory. And so we don't have anything there, nor is there any pre-Christian literature that speaks of the Son of Man suffering. And thus it's been commonly understood that Jesus here is tying up some loose ends, uniting the Son of Man on the one hand, that glorious character in Daniel, with the suffering servant of Isaiah 53, and basically announcing those two are the same guy. Jesus turns the lights on. Peter, you may recall over in 1 Peter, speaking of the gospel, says that prophets had tried to figure out, they'd searched intently, trying to put the pieces together all through the ages, trying to see how the Spirit of Christ in them was pointing to the suffering of Christ and at the same time the glory that was going to follow. Peter says it was revealed to them that they were not serving themselves but us, when they spoke to us of the things that have now been told us by those who preach the gospel to them. And then Peter says, even angels wish they could look into these things. But it's only when Christ pulls it all together that we begin to see the lights come on. Someone said the Old Testament is a room richly furnished, dimly lit, We kind of grew up in the Old Testament for the details, but when Christ comes, the lights come on. And at this point we realize, these are the same guy, the Son of Man, the suffering servant, the Messiah, the King, the Son of David, all of them being brought together now in this remarkable display of God's wisdom in giving us that Old Testament account. The other thing that's striking in this text is the way in which you have sovereignty of God united with human responsibility. The Son of Man must go as it has been written, but woe to the man by whom he goes. You see. How do you put that together? Well, that's an easy question. How do we put together the sovereignty of God and human freedom? One of those kind of easy Sunday school questions that we don't worry too much about. All I'll tell you is this. We in the Reformed tradition, I believe it's true, more than any other Christian tradition, have not only not skirted this issue, we have made a robust, open, and joyful embracing of this great mystery. And we want to watch out, and we've not been altogether successful throughout history in this, but we want to watch out for the twin errors that go in either direction. People that emphasize the sovereignty of God to the point that they reduce human beings essentially to puppets, are heading toward fatalism, which is manifestly not the biblical understanding. To say God is sovereign is not to say that we are puppets on a string. This is what Paul entertains in Romans chapter 9 when he says, "You will therefore say to me, why does God blame me? Who can resist his will? I'm just a puppet on a string," you see. And Paul says, hold the phone. This isn't what we mean when we say God is sovereign. But when we go the other direction, we tend toward the fatal error of deism, which makes God just a spectator, watching TV, wondering what we're going to do next, biting his nails, hoping it all turns out okay. A helpless, impotent, crippled deity who's basically checked out, and it's all up to us and our freedom. That's not a real pretty picture either. What is it? The best way I've ever heard it put is simply, and I don't know any better way to say it, but it's this. God ordains the free choices of human beings. God ordains the free choices of human beings. The Westminster Confession of Faith is the classical expression of Reformed theology, going back to 1647. Paragraph 1 of chapter 3 of the Westminster. God from all eternity did, by the most wise and holy counsel of his own will, freely and unchangeably ordain whatsoever comes to pass. Yet so, as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creature, nor is the liberty or contingency of ordinary causation taken away, but rather established. Now you might be wondering, how does God do that exactly? And I got news for you. I've got the answer. Beats me! But I'm going to tell you a little something. As I've said before, some of you have heard it. The fact that I cannot explain how God does something is no argument that He's unable to do it, especially when God says He does it. And virtually every page of the Bible bears testimony to God working through the free choices of human beings to do exactly what He has ordained would take place. Joseph classically says it, Genesis chapter 50, what you intended for harm, God intended for good. I don't know quite how He does that. But I'm willing to accept that if God says that's what He does, that I'm better off not to argue with Him on it, you see. And at this point, the Son of Man goes as it has been written to Him, but woe to that completely responsible human being by whom these things he would have been better off never being born. And there it is. A great mystery, but one that is nevertheless unabashedly asserted again and again. If you read the Bible much, you know that pops up all the time. All right, now we come to the final paragraph. As they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, gave it to them and said, "Take, eat, this is my body, the paschal lamb." Then He took the cup. When He had given thanks, gave it to them. They all drank from it, that's the third cup. And He said to them, "This is my blood of the covenant." The word new was added later. "Which is shed for many. Assuredly I say to you, I will no longer eat the fruit of the vine." And there's a subtle change here to the fourth cup. Yeah, it's subtle, I realize. But that's about the only way you can understand the whole text. "Until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God." And when they'd sung a hymn, but they hadn't drunk the cup, you see, they went out. As they were eating, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it. This is at the beginning of the third part. "This is my body." So this is the point when, in a sense, in a sacramental way, this is the paschal lamb. This is the blood, the body of the paschal lamb, which is given to you. The emphasis is Jesus gives it to us. It's emphasizing the gift aspect. Jesus is giving us the most valuable gift we could possibly imagine. Hence we call it the Eucharist. The Greek word Eucharisto means I give thanks, the noun form thanksgiving. And so we receive this body and blood as a gift with thanksgiving. Justin Martyr would say 100 years later, the Lord's Supper is food made up all of thanksgiving. Jesus says, take it and eat it. It is my gift of life to you. It makes you part of me, and it makes you thereby part of my kingdom and a citizen in it, because it means the atoning work I'm about to accomplish tomorrow on the cross is being applied to you. The benefits are being received by you, but unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you don't have my life in you elsewhere, you see. So this remarkable moment, the New Testament is filled with these kinds of references. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 5, "For Christ our Passover was sacrificed for us." This statement, "This is my body, hoc est corpus meum," has been called the most controversial words in the history of the human race, and I think it's probably true. And the way I'm going to deal with it is by not dealing with it. I've done it at length elsewhere, all the traditions, transubstantiation, etc., of a real presence, memorial view, all of that. Very interesting stuff beyond the scope of my immediate concern. I'm just going to leave it with Augustine's great summary statement in which he asks the question, how is the bread his body? That is to say, how can it be? And the cup, or that which the cup contains, how can that be his blood? Augustine says, these are therefore called sacramentum. the Latin word mystery. Because in them one thing is seen while another thing is understood. There is some great powerful truth in the idea that Jesus gives us his body and blood, and that while we don't go with the Catholic view of transubstantiation, nevertheless we say in some deep, profound, unique way, his body and his blood are given to us in the sacrament, and there is a huge benefit that we experience by participating in it, just as these men did in that last Passover that they celebrated. He took the cup, and when he had given thanks, he gave it to them, and they all drank from it. This is the third cup now. This marks the end of the meal. He gives it to them with thanksgiving. They all drink from it, which one commentator noted is a phrase used only in Mark because Mark is trying to highlight the contrast. These guys all drank from the cup. They all thereby pledged their allegiance, but they're the same ones who all fell away, all abandoned, all fled. They have been accepted by Christ, given this gift, and yet that doesn't make them perfect. And so what's actually happening here is a great story of Christ's faithfulness, not a great story of their faithfulness. Jim Edwards says, quote, "The original Last Supper, attended by traitors and cowards, was not a table of merit, but a table of grace." He says, this is the blood of the covenant. Now, the best textual evidence is that the word new was added early but later and was not part of Mark's original text. If that's the case, then the phrase itself is a direct quote from the original Passover setting, and that's probably what's going on. It's the blood of the covenant, which harkens back to the covenant that Moses originally put in place in the original Passover. This language is graphic, but it gets to the point. Moses took half the blood and put it in basins, and half the blood he sprinkled on the altar. Then he took the book of the covenant and read in the hearing of the people, and they said, all the Lord has said we will do, and be obedient. The pledge of faithfulness, you see. Then Moses took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant, which the Lord has made with you according to these words. When Jesus says, in a sense, this is the blood of the covenant, what he's saying is this is the real blood of the covenant. A lamb was sacrificed 1,000 years ago or so. That was an animal, and its blood was... But blood of animals doesn't atone for anything. We hear in Hebrews, the blood of bulls and goats and the ashes of an heifer have no value for atoning for sins. How could they? It's just an animal that's being slaughtered. How could that atone for anyone's sins? There is a true blood of the covenant. And since Jesus announces to his disciples, here it is. This is the blood of the covenant. And on that premise, we would say, therefore, the people who were saved in the Old Testament, the people who were redeemed in the Old Testament were redeemed by the blood of Christ just as much as anybody in the New. It's one great family of faith. Jesus is the blood of the covenant, whether it's the Old Covenant or the New Covenant. He is the one whose blood is exclusively sufficient to achieve the atoning effect that the Passover is indeed celebrating. This blood is not simply sprinkled on people in this Passover. It is ingested unless a man eats this flesh and drinks this blood. It's horrifying language, isn't it? The original Jewish people who heard it were absolutely aghast to hear that kind of thing said. But Jesus is speaking in stark, harsh terms to drive it home. You must eat me. I am the paschal lamb. You must participate in this life that I am offering you. They were so horrified they mostly abandoned him at that point. You remember John chapter 6. But this is really what the Old Testament anticipates. Listen to Jeremiah. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law in their minds, internalized, radicalized, put inside them. I will write it on their hearts. I will be their God. They will be my people. No more do they depend on each other, saying, know the Lord. They will all know me, from the least to the greatest, priesthood of all believers. We see there. For I will forgive their iniquity, their sin I will remember no more. The blood of the covenant thus is given to us, eaten, drunk by us, and that makes us a part of Christ, and it makes us a part of the kingdom that he's establishing. So Jesus says, this is the blood of the covenant shed for many. In the old covenant scheme, you had many, many sacrifices over and over, atoning for one person. In the new covenant, you've got one sacrifice atoning for many people. You see, the blood of the covenant shed for many. Assuredly, I say to you, I will no longer drink the fruit of the vine until the day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Now, here's where we have this subtle shift. Mark is assuming we're quite familiar with the Passover liturgy generally, and so otherwise this can slip right past us. But he says, I won't drink the fruit of the vine. They've already drunk the one cup, and now we sort of moves to this last cup. I'm not going to drink this one, is the sense of it. Shifting from that retrospective blood of the covenant that he's just referred to the prospective now new covenant cup that is the fourth cup. The phrase here is striking, and it's impossible to translate, so bear with me as I try to give you the idea. The words here are uketi ume. Uketi normally is translated no longer. I will no longer drink. That's the way it's usually translated. But what makes this interesting is we have two additional negatives. Which is the negative used with the indicative mood. May, which is the word used with the non-indicative mood. They both mean not. No, I will no longer, not yet. No. It's a powerful kind of idiomatic expression that there'd be no possible way to really give us the flavor of it in English, except to just say that this is something that had a kind of powerful impact, and it would suggest at least a high degree of urgency. It's as if Jesus took the cup, and they were all expecting him now to offer it. Okay, here's the final cup. This is the final consummate expression of what the Passover stands for. And then he says, wait, no, not yet. I cannot drink it yet until the ordeal is over. I cannot drink it yet until the events celebrated in the Passover actually happen, until the paschal lamb is actually offered, slain, that blood broken. This cup must wait. And so we have this sense in which there's something coming, and it has to occur. There's been all kinds of attempts to understand this text. Some have seen it as referring to heaven or the millennium, but it does seem the best view of it, and this is certainly not my invention. This has been, I think, pretty well established by competent commentators on this text. It's called the fourth cup theory. The fourth cup was withheld until after the events of the crucifixion. So Jesus holds off, postpones the fourth cup. One Jewish scholar who's writing from a Christian perspective, I think, gives a great summary of what's going on here. He says, quote, there is in Matthew and Mark a reference also to the fourth and last cup of the Passover liturgy. It's contained in the words, I will not drink henceforth of this fruit of the vine until I drink it new in my Father's kingdom or in the kingdom of God. Then he continues, the meaning is that the fourth cup will not be taken, as would be the normal thing at a subsequent stage of the service. It will be postponed till the kingdom is fully established. In this light, the notice that when they'd sung a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives now acquires a fuller sense. The implication is that they go out directly after the hymn without drinking the fourth cup, and probably without also reciting the final blessing. This portion of the liturgy is postponed until the arrival of the actual final kingdom. So when is the fourth cup drunk? It is drunk, my friends, in the Eucharist. When we come to the Lord's Supper, when we take that cup, when the pastor says, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, we are holding the fourth cup of that Passover celebration that took place 2,000 years ago. And we come day by day, week by week, year by year, participating in that last supper, that last Passover. And just as those original disciples were able to enter into this intimate connection with Christ and enjoy the benefits that he promised, so do we. as we come and take this gift, this Eucharist that is given to us at that point. Thus, in the New Testament, we have this Eucharistic language again and again. They will come from the east and the west, the north and the south, and sit down in the kingdom of God. So they sang a hymn and left that cup undrunk until after the resurrection, when we hear multiple times of Jesus breaking bread with them. The road to Emmaus, he broke bread, gave them the cup. We have this impression that this is when now the true fourth cup is being enjoyed by them as well as by us. So they went out, they sang the last hymns of the Hallel. They went to the Mount of Olives, which is associated with the great exodus that would take place under Messiah, Zechariah 14. And look at that. I made it with 60 seconds to spare. I'm so proud of myself. All right, here it is. Sunday School Lesson, point 1. Our preparation to serve Christ is only effective because Christ has already made preparation for us. When the disciples went into Jerusalem, they found everything as Jesus had said. Our task is not to go out and overestimate our importance. God has already gone before us, prepared the way. His preparation is what makes my preparation worth anything at all. It's only because He has prepared the way that anything we do will have any kind of efficacy. And so these men were living out what God had ordained for them, and they could do it with great joy because they knew, in fact, it was a sovereign God who had made the initial preparation. Our faithfulness to serve Christ is only possible because Christ has been faithful to us. The message we've learned here is that the disciples were miserable failures, every one of them. It's true enough, Judas betrayed Christ. It could have been Peter. He denied Him with curses. The other guys were nowhere to be found. It could have been any one of them. It could have been any of us. Our salvation is not rooted on any virtue that we bring to the table, heaven forbid. It's rooted on the virtue of Christ and His faithfulness to us, and in that we take great joy. Because as soon as my salvation hinges on my faithfulness, I am doomed. Point 3, our joy to serve Christ is only meaningful because Christ has offered Himself as our paschal lamb, inviting us to eat and drink His salvation. And when we come to the Eucharistic meal, we are supposed to be thinking that we're there with the disciples, drinking that fourth cup because the atoning work of Christ has been completed.